All right, welcome to the first lecture of the series. It's Intro to Photography. We'll go over core concepts, and this is specifically somewhat structured towards VRC. In this lecture, we will go over all photography principles, but a lot of it will be tailored to some of the specialities of VRChat. And first and foremost, what is photography? Comes from the Greek writing with light, how to paint an image. The basic principles of light. You have light and dark, your contrast, which varies in intensity. The lowest light that the human eye can actually detect is about 200 times less than the brightest. So while it might seem like there's a pretty large range of light and dark, it's relatively narrow that you can perceive. Controlling the intensity, you have to control the light intensity to gather an image in the first place. And photographers will do this by using aperture versus exposure. Also ISO, but that's something that doesn't really apply to VR because we don't have that yet. And then sensitivity in general is it too dark or is it too bright? And like we were talking about earlier, that is the underexposure versus overexposure. Light and dark, a concept called tenebrism, basically dictates that in a tenebrism photo, you will have a subject that has very harsh light with very contrasting shadows, like you can see on Riven here in the right photo, or I forget who that sculptor is for the left one, but essentially it creates a very dynamic photo by making this hard contrast with hard lines. This is actually kind of hard to do in VRChat unless you're in a world that has drop lights or strong contrast lighting, because most VR worlds tend to be very flat and optimized for like parties and stuff. There are some things you can put on your Avi that do have lights on them, but they're kind of complicated and very heavy. So same with VRChat Lens, the photography system that a lot of people do end up using, that we will go over in a later lecture. It is possible to put on your Avi, but you have to start with a very good Avi and then build up to being a very poor. Like the camera system alone turns a green into a red. Sensitivity, you have underexposed versus overexposed. I would argue all three of these photos are good or acceptable, but on purpose, the left one is an underexposed shot. On the right, it is overexposed to give it that summer feel. And then a very bounced photo in the middle, which was something I did with Sumi the other day. When it comes to bouncing your photo, in the editor, you will find an exposure bar, or when you're taking the shot with VRC lens or a real camera, you'll have an exposure bar, and you'll bracket that to be a bounced exposed image. One of the biggest things about VR and photography is that bar will lie to you. Like I talked about earlier, avatar lighting, as you can see with Sumi, right, doesn't match the background lighting at all, no matter where you are. It's just something that with VRChat Avis that have their own lighting system built in, and like the skin tone built in, it will never match. So to get a VR photo to match the background, you end up having to layer edit, and we'll go over that later. So how does a photographer control intensity? There are three things you can do on a camera to change how much light comes into the camera. Most of this won't apply to VR unless you're using VRC lens. So you have your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. The aperture works extremely similarly to the way the human iris works, the human pupil, well, also iris, to be fair. The more light you need to take in, the larger the aperture will be. We also call this the f-stop. If you're using the in-game camera, that setting will be a number from 1 to, I think, 22 is the highest it goes. And it's not actually listed as an f-stop, it's just a fixed number. If you're on VRChat Lens, it will be listed as an f-stop. So if I ever talk about f-stop or aperture, we're talking about the same thing. Hi, you're late. The smaller that f-stop number is, the smaller your aperture is, the wider that is, and the more light the camera can take in. However, it means that your depth of field is affected because the further you go with the open iris, the less the camera can actually focus in on. Another thing that can change your light intake is shutter speed, which you won't really find in VR at all. Not yet. I think someone is working on a shutter speed option to a camera. So for now, don't worry about it unless you're going to do any IRL photography. ISO, same thing. Very simply, the more ISO you have on your camera means the more light it can actually perceive, the more it can take in. And the higher that ISO number is, the more, not pixelated, but they call it noisy. The more noisy an image will be. You can see on the diagram here at 25/600. It's very noisy. It looks like a film grain. That's how you get that old-timey photo look. You can also add that in post. Some of these shots you might end up taking, you might want to end up doing that. But that's something, that's a artistic choice. So those are the 3 ways that photographers can change how much light goes from the camera to make that balanced image. Generally speaking, you're going to want to set your ISO as low as possible, and then play with the shutter and aperture to get that balanced image around that bracket. So, how does aperture and exposure in VR change instead of IRL? The biggest difference is that there is no ISO in the ISO setting in the game, as we said. Aperture does not affect exposure at all in VRC Lens, which is interesting, because instead of playing this dynamic seesaw effect, you can just pick one and stick with it, which is very nice. Exposure itself can't be adjusted in game camera. It can in VRC Lens, which is very handy. It saves you a lot of time in editing later. And then the aperture system in game does not create a focal plane like VRCL does. What this means is that when you're using the basic in-game camera and you pick a person and you highlight them, right? Or put your focal point on a subject, the game will take everything around said subject and make it in focus, and everything outside of that subject out of focus. What this inherently does is make pockets of sharp images next to blurry, bokeh pieces of your image. Unlike this photo of Sumi here, where the lower half is blurry and the top half is in focus, basically most of her would be in focus and everything around would be blurred. This can cause issues when you're, say, shooting at a school setting where you're sitting at a desk and the subject's hand is over a notebook. Sometimes with the in-game camera, part of that notebook will also be sharp because it's touching the subject. With VRC Lens, when you're changing your focal length, you're changing your f-stop, you actually make a physical strip of what is in focus and then what's blurred behind it in front of it. And it makes it very, I have to say easy. It's much better to make a fluid image. That's, I think, my biggest reason that's validating buying VRC Lens, especially if you're going to try to take more photos in general. Now, to actually take the shot, what are some of the things we have to look into? Headroom, rule of thirds, getting off of center, and background choice. There are more nuanced things to this, but essentially, I think my biggest gripe with a lot of people that take photos in VR is that they don't ever have headroom. And headroom means that when you're shooting your subject, you have space around and behind to see the entire subject. The photo in the middle here, I don't remember actually who shot this one. It's one of my friends. It's a good photo and I like it, but I find so many VR chatters, especially the more risque side of VR chat Twitter, who post body shots, never have headroom or body room for their subject. It's always cut, it's always cropped. And it is a choice, but it shouldn't be your only choice. You should have a balanced range of what you do. Up in the right, bottom right, you can say this golden spiral. This isn't the overlay you have to use. A lot of people use a grid system instead to push their images to the side and get their subject off of center. I tend to use a combination of this golden ratio and a grid when I frame out my images. And you can see that reflecting if you were to mirror this up top with the photo of Ran. You have the focal point right in the center that spirals out and catches your eye and brings you to the subject, and then lets you out through the background. Similar principle with the grass and sunlight shot that I took, I guess 2 or 3 years ago at this point. But framing is very, very important, just as much as keeping the image sharp and in focus is. So how do we paint with light? Because what you're doing as a photographer isn't so much uh, trying to stage an image. Sometimes you do, but usually you're trying to find the light in front of you and paint with it to make it work for you. Because unlike other art forms, you can't obviously put paintbrush to it and set up what you want. So things you have to ask are there more than one sources of light? Is it a high intensity light? Is it low contrast? Is it early morning? You can add stuff in VR, but it's super hard because you have to have drop lights, like I said. One of the core concepts when it comes to photography and catching the light is, are you trying to catch a candid moment or are you setting up a scene? Both are equally as good and equally as powerful, but they come with their own challenges. When it comes to shooting a photo or any kind of art form in general, you're looking for breaks in patterns, breaks in repetition, the concept of symmetry versus asymmetry, and storytelling, obviously. One of the biggest uses of photography is photojournalism. This won't really work in VR. I mean, it kind of can. You could argue people like YouTubers like Drumsy, right? Push a narrative through storytelling based on videography, right? You can do the same thing with photography, but more so in VR photos, it's going to be candid shots of like friends and parties, and then lots of headshots, which is why most things I shoot in VR tend to be headshots. And then the last concept I'll leave with painting with light is less is often more. Sometimes it can be enticing to add a lot to a photo, but at a certain point, the more you start to add, the more it'll take away from the actual core of the image and how your eye is going to flow through it. And this is true for most mediums too. There's two quotes that I really liked when I was first starting. One from my first professor, Carrie Tomberlin. She said, on the first day of class, it takes about 300 photos to get about 2 good ones. And the better you are, the more you practice, the longer you shoot, the less that number gets. But even then, it'll still take anywhere from 30 to 60 photos to get a single good one. That's just the nature of the business, the nature of trying to catch a moment. Because you're not, again, you can't make everything work for you when it comes to photography because you're playing with a force you can't control. And then Henry Bresson once said, your first 10,000 photographs are your worst. And the only thing I would add to that is the next 10,000 are still going to be worse than the next 10,000. It's
just a little bit better, though.
Yeah, it's just repetition, 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 practicing, and working on your editing. And that's pretty much the basic overview of what photography is and what it does and how to tailor what you're looking for to how to shoot. Now we're going to step away from that, and we'll get more in depth with most of these concepts when we go to actually editing stuff in a week or two. But for now, we're going to go through how to set up your editor and how to make it work for you.